Hey guys, it's Convolva here and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to look at how to create this sound. Alright, so this is a sound that's very common in modern electronic music and you might have already heard of this sound. I've also used similar sounds in a lot of my psytrance and hardstyle projects, so without further ado, let's get right to it. So this sound was made with the help of Hammer and we use Patcher for this, so I'm gonna add this video to the Patcher series. So this is how the sound sounds. Yeah. So let's create a new patch and call it brass sound. So let me load up patcher. I'm going to be using Hammer to create the sound, but any other true additive synth can also be used to create the sound. The reason why I mentioned the word true additive synth is because there are a lot of additive synths these days which have a generator which uses additive capabilities to generate sounds such as Serum, but then the filtering section is subtractive in nature and does not really incorporate additive stuff like Hammer does. The main differentiator with synths like Hammer is that the filtering section is also part of the generation, which means that whenever you remove certain frequencies by cutting things in the filter, it actually does not generate those frequencies. Which means that if you use a filter such as a low pass on Hammer and remove certain frequencies, then Hammer would not generate those frequencies in the first place. Now we can get into the weeds of this, but that's not really important for this tutorial. So just know that Hammer is quite powerful as compared to other additive synths. So we're going to use that for today's tutorial. All right, enough theory for one day. Let's get Hammer here. So to add the plugin, I'm just going to middle mouse click here and that's going to bring up our list. And I'll just type Hammer here and double click here. So it's gonna bring Hammer onto my patch and I can make sounds here. Now I would like to divide the sound into two parts. First part being the body of the brass sound and then the second sound being the transient. So for this, I'm going to use part A to create the body and part B to create the transient. Part A and B work in similar ways how Silent One part A and B work. They both can create unique sounds and then you get to mix them together and that's the sound your synth generates. For creating this, the first thing that you would need is a saw wave. So we by default have a saw wave. Saw waves are closest to how a brass instrument sounds. So therefore it'll be a good oscillator shape for us to get started with. So the first thing we're going to do is use this low pass filter that is there here. And we're going to right click here and hit edit articulator, which is going to open up the articulator of filter 1 frequency here. And I'm gonna make a simple low pass shape like this, and let's say I use double curve to create this shape, and let's bring up tempo and do this, and let me reduce the low pass as well, and let's say I increase it and then bring it down because that's how a brass instrument would sound. So let's say I use single and instead of double curve, and make a shape like this, like this. This will mimic how a brass sound sounds, and it has this initial swell, which is what this first part is representing, and then we have a gradual decline. You can also control the timings of these with these ADSR knobs here. This is just going to change the time multiple of these settings in percentages, which you can check in the hint panel. And you might have noticed that this already takes the sound a lot closer to a brass instrument. Now, the brass instrument's harmonic profile is not exactly like a saw wave, and it can vary a lot because it's an organic instrument. So, we are going to use unison to bring that randomness in. And for that, I'm going to use a unison order of 2. This will help dull and soften the saw characteristics of the waveform a little bit, making it more like the real instrument. Let me just decrease the pitch of it by 1 octave here so that I can hear the lower notes as well. Alright, now that we got this, let's take further inspiration from the real brass instrument while creating the sound. Based on how it was designed, if less air goes inside the brass instrument, then it produces a lower pitch sound, which means the pitch will go up as the air goes inside the brass instrument. So let's use a pitch envelope, and for that, we can go here inside this drop down and click on pitch, and we can make a shape like this. But to engage it, we need to engage it here by enabling. This is because the air that goes inside the brass instrument goes in gradually, and no human can hit the perfect pitch at an instant like a transient. So, when the instrument players blow the air inside, the pitch tends to go up before it hits the correct pitch. You could also have something like an overshoot graph where it goes just a little above where you want the pitch to be eventually and then comes back down to reach that value. So to mimic that, we're going to use a pitch articulation, which is what this shape is. And we're going to create a shape like this. Alright, this is fine, but I feel like the decay is a little too long, so let me reduce the decay a little. I feel like the low pass is a little too low, so I'm going to go again into the articulator and bring this up. And to do that, I'm going to hit Alt on my keyboard, the left Alt, and just move it up a little. Alright, that's good. Now let's move to the transient part. So I'm going to engage part B for that, and I'm going to mute part A so I only focus on the part B. And again, we're going to use a saw shape for creating the transient. And I'm going to create a filter envelope just like before with the low pass. And to create the filter articulation, I'm going to go inside part A because we already made this and copy this state and go inside part B and paste this state. This is going to copy that shape. So we need to reduce this. Now part B is mostly to capture those imperfections that happen inside a real life instrument and little sounds which add character to the instrument. So the more time you put into this part, the better and more realistic it's going to end up sounding like. So we're going to do something really basic here for this transient. However, you can really go overboard and do all kinds of crazy stuff to mimic a real life instrument. It can also help if you can sample someone's embouchure and put that into the image section here and play that with the part A. But yeah, we're not going to do any of that. We're going to do something really simple for part B, and I'm going to focus mostly on the pitch articulation. So let's go to pitch articulator and bring this down, and let's go a lot lower as it is just responsible for the initial part and not really the entire sound. And let's actually increase the low pass like this. Alright, great. So now that we have this, let's also shape the volume envelope for part B so that it's only at the beginning part and not through the body, because we have a different layer for that. So I'm going to go inside volume here, which is the second option here, and create a shape like this. Let me engage this and create a shape like so. Bring this down, engage tempo, so it shows me the grid based on tempo. And let's go with something like this. Let's decrease this like so. Again, I'm using a volume envelope where it rises slowly, even though it's the transient, because even though we try to hit the note very perfectly, it's still going to take us some time before the sound can go up to the full volume. So I'm gonna do that again here. And I have a quick decay here so that it cuts off quickly before the body can show itself. Let's play it with the part A. I still feel like the pitch movement in A is a little too much, so I'm going to reduce this a little so that it only moves a smaller distance in pitch. Like so. Let's again go to the low pass in part A and edit this a little further. And you can see it already starts to sound a lot like a trumpet now. So without the part B, it sounds like this. But with it, now this sounds good to me, but when I hit the higher notes, it seems like it sounds a little synthy, and you can hear it if I isolate part B. It almost sounds dubsteppy. To mitigate this, what we can do is to use a low pass filter keyboard mapping, and that could reduce the filter's cutoff as we hit the higher notes. So we need to set that up. We need to be in filter 1 frequency, which is this one, and then inside that we get all these options here. We can select keyboard mapping, which is the third setting here, and when I hit notes you can actually see which notes I'm hitting inside this graph. The way this graph works is the left hand side represents the lower keys and the right hand side represents the higher notes. The value you select in this graph is basically this knob's position. So to reduce it when I hit the higher notes, what I can do is create a graph like this and reduce it like so. So whenever I hit a higher note, it will reduce the value of this frequency 1 so that it is a little more muffled. And you can already feel that. And I'm going to set it with part A engaged. Alright, so now it's taking some better shape. Let's also reduce the volume level of part B when it goes higher with another keyboard mapping, but for the volume. So we can do the same thing here. Go inside volume, go inside keyboard mapping and reduce it so that the volume reduces when we hit the higher note. Now this is all cool, although I would like to reduce the volume level of the transient a little bit. And to do that, I'm going to use this part A and B mix, which is basically how much of each is going to be mixed into the sound. So I'm going to push it a little towards the part A. And this is going to give me more of the body and less of the transient. Alright, so far so good. So let's go inside the effects section and add some reverb here. This is going to help make it more realistic because usually these instruments are in a real space and reverb can really help with that. Let's also saturate the sound a little bit. I am doing this only to increase the harmonic content a little and deviate it just a tad from the regular saw series, but this is just a personal preference thing. Now that I've got this, I would like to also have some sort of metallic touch to this because it's a metallic instrument and I'm going to use a delay unit to create a metallic tone. Let's go back here inside the patcher chain and add delay 3. Delay 3, drag it and drop it in this line, which is going to connect it automatically into the effect chain. By default, delay 3 is going to have this sound. Alright, but in order to make it more metallic, let me remove the tempo sync feature here. And you would notice that it already starts to sound a lot more metallic. Let's tweak it a little more. I'm going to add a little bit of this feedback so it rings a little more. And let's make it a little stereo as well by engaging the right and left offset towards the left side. And I'm also going to add a little bit of modulation, and this is going to just move the pitches a little more so that it's not that consistent, and we can control the rate with this. Now this can be a little too much, so we need to control that, and to do that what I'm going to do is pass the wet signal through here and then pass the dry signal separately. I'm going to reduce the dry signal so we only get the wet sound and then pass the dry signal parallelly. Let's reduce the wet signal a little with this volume slider. I think this can be reduced a little. So let's also EQ the wet sound a little so that it only has certain frequencies, and for that I'm going to use Fruity parametric EQ and high pass this, change the order like this. Alright, now that we got that, let's add reverb so it gets a little more sense of space. For that I'm going to just use Fruity Reverb to just increase the decay. Now you can use any settings, but I'm just creating some arbitrary settings here. Now I have selected these settings here. You can simply copy them. It's just a simple reverb with a decay time of 2.5 seconds, and I've also reduced the dry signal while increasing the wet signal similar to the levels of dry signal, and added a little bit of modulation through these two knobs. For more info, you can actually check the recent post I made on reverb if you would like to know more about it. I also have a preset which you can check over here. Let's also reduce this rate a little. Now it's starting to sound a lot like a real instrument. Let's add some multiband expansion to this sound to enhance those mid and high frequencies a little more. And for that, I'm going to use Maximus, which is perfect for this. And I'm gonna just move the mid and high tensions a little. And let's add a final EQ to finish this sound. And this is personal preference. You can create any shape, but I like to have a lot more of that high frequency and maybe a little bit of higher mids. Let's add some MIDI so that we can get a preview of this sound. So I'm going to copy the MIDI I wrote initially. Group selected, instrument, give it a good color, and let's paste. Actually, this reminds me we need to give an envelope to the volume of the part A as well. So let's quickly do that. Let's give it a shape like this. And if you'd like to control the abrasiveness of the brass instrument, simply go to the part B and control this low pass here. The more of that transient you have, the more synthetic it's going to sound and more aggressive it's going to sound. A lot can also depend on how you write your MIDI. So if you notice here, I have sort of used some velocity mapping here, and I have changed the notes positions also so that they're more humanized and they feel realistic. Simply nudge them forward or backwards like this. And I'm using left alt on my keyboard to move them in a finer way. So let's check it with some examples now. If you'd like to get custom music made, then hit me up over here and I'll be sure to get back to you. Thanks for watching.